This is our local. This is our. These are our people. And I welcome Jony and Stephen to our community, and it's great to have you here. And Ali and myself have been living here for 30 years this year. So we love Dalkey, and we love Shan and David, and we think it's a great gift to Dalkey. Actually, not just Dalkey, but to Dublin, this festival. It's really something very special. So thank you to Shan and David. Thank you so much. Now, you will all be very relieved that I am not going to do the talking, and for once. And yeah, I just want to say, yeah, it's a great community, more diverse community than you'd imagine. Even more diverse than this mammal would suggest. But friendship is at the heart of today's dialogue. Friendship and sort of fan worship, and not just mine. These men are both crazy about each other, and both crazy about the stuff each other makes. Stephen has said that the first Mac made him want to write. But this is a friendship of two men who express themselves through very different mediums and media, and we're going to try today to find an overlap between the two. It's slightly unfair format to Jony, as this is not his medium. So to start, Stephen, is it true that the first Mac?
Yes, and it really was the first Mac, or technically the second Mac ever sold in Europe. My great friend and a friend of Jony's too was the much-missed Douglas Adams, the author of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy books, and an extraordinary man who's missed every day. I sometimes need him to tell me what to think about technology and things and human behaviour. He had such an extraordinary insight. And we both loved computers and micros, as they were called in the late 70s and early 80s. And this announcement to the build-up of this new machine was coming in 1984. And in January the 25th, I think it was, he and I both went into a shop in London and ordered each one. We each ordered one, and it was transformative. It was extraordinary. It seems so obvious to everyone now, and many of you are far too young to remember that time when a computer was a code line thing with just a keyboard and a green neon, and you had to write in commands. This thing of WIMPs, Windows icons, mice, and pull-down menus. I think it stands for. All this idea of a little wastepaper basket or bin and folders and a graphic user interface, as it's known in the trade, a GUI. This was new, and it said hello on the screen. In all the advertising, it said hello. And that's not a small thing. It's about what we're talking about now. It's about design and it's about language. It didn't give a picture. It said the word hello. And it invited you in. And it did. Every day I would get up and I would be so excited. I'd see it there and I would want to write in a way that, much as I love paper and pencil, and we can talk about that sort of thing later, it did. Right. No question.
And Jony, or if it was an object that's set off Stephen, are there any writings that set you off, or did that ever play a role in your life?
Well, I mean, I love to draw, and on paper and with a pen. But that comes much later. Ideas and writing, I've always started my design process and creative process, writing and thinking, and to me, they're sort of synonymous. Way before I actually start to draw. There's something very powerful about drawing, but there are obvious limitations. I mean, you can't draw hot or heavy or light. You can't draw how something looks in particular materials. There's a power to language that I think forces you to engage with the issues and enjoy the ambiguity, which early on is very important. I mean, if we were working on redesigning that, if I said, if I started drawing a lectern you can guarantee what I would start to draw. But if I started to think and write and say some plane needs to be supported at a certain height and it would be good if it didn't topple off, I've not shut down 1,000 ideas that I would shut down immediately if I'd started drawing that.
Which you do not want to.
I would never draw that. Never.
Is that upsetting you? Is our lecturing upsetting you?
Well, it's not. It's a tribute to the screws.
The screws,
isn't it?
exactly. Exactly.
It's
Do objects annoy you? I mean, do you wake up?
Poor Lecter, he blushed slightly.
we saw his bottom.
Do objects annoy you?
Actually, it's the lack of care that. So no, the object doesn't annoy me. It's the people responsible for it that annoy me. So there's an ocean we could put it in. But no, just I think one of the things that I've struggled with is, there's always the tendency to want to describe a product in terms of those things that are easy to talk about. We talk about product attributes you can measure with a number, and that feels very comfortable. But we make most of the most important life decisions in the absence of hard metrics, don't we? And I do believe that we sense, I don't understand the mechanism for this, but I do believe we sense care. And we sense the care of the people that got together to design and make something. And I think very often it's easier to sense carelessness.
Yes.
And so to me, it's nothing to do with the object. It's to do with whether somebody thought it was important enough to be bothered to care about.
And I know something you care about is even beyond the design of the object. And this is something I was absolutely obsessed and fanatical about. I could not believe that people would sell you an object, no matter whether it was an expensive one or a cheap one, that was wrapped and packaged in such a way that it was agony to undo. And many people still do. You know, have you ever bought something and when you're staying in a hotel and you don't have scissors and you think, well, I can't, it's welded plastic. And when I was a smoker, I could set fire to it to open it. And I thought, I want to be the CEO of a company so that I can say to the design team and the packaging team and the logistics team, so bring me the thing exactly as the customer will get it. And then I would try and open it and I'd show them my broken fingernails and the blood pouring down the side of it. And I'd say, you're all fired. But you...
Sounds like Steve Jobs.
Yeah, exactly. And you and Steve had that same view about packaging and making... And you bring these beautiful little tear strips. So you buy an Apple object now, and it's, we're obviously going to be a bit of Apple worship here, because that's your thing, and that's what you've been doing. And everything opens, and it's presented, and it's pulled out. It's... The thing that's important about that is not just the convenience for the consumer, is you feel... And this is going to sound so pretentious, you feel the love coming out of it. You feel that the company that makes this wants me to enjoy and to respond at an emotional level to something that may well be a machine, but is going to be with me, and I'm going to hold it, it's going to be in my pocket.
People don't naturally think of Steve Jobs as that kind of a character, but you would probably think differently, wouldn't you? How did he feel about the objects? Where did you cross over in that? Is what what our Stephen here is saying is true?
No, it's absolutely true. I mean, there's a tendency, if you're putting an inordinate amount of care, that you might not be able to measure how many pounds of care. You can normally measure the consequences in dollars. So if you care that much, well, it's going to cost an extra that much. And I think that he said something, actually it was an internal meeting at Apple, and he was essentially saying, we talk a lot about, what we do, and we talk about how we do it, but I want to talk about why we do it. And he said, you know, we've all got different ways of being, but some of us, and the role for some of us, is to get together and to make something, and to make something with love and care for people. And we may never know their story, and we probably won't shake their hand. But by making something with care and love, we express our appreciation to our species. And I think motivation's really important. And when you don't want a conversation to devolve into two is a larger number than one, when you don't want to go there, I think to describe, well, why are we doing this? And I can't think of anything much more important or noble than to express our gratitude to each other.
Wow, that's quite a...
Yeah.
I didn't say that.
If I could just add to that, one of the things that, again, people may have forgotten because people always have a very, very short memory when it comes to things like technology. But in the mid-90s, Apple was, as they say, in the toilet. The inventory was piled up in warehouses. Nothing was being sold. Everybody was saying the company is going to go bust. And Steve came back, and Steve and Jony got together and produced the iMac, and then there was the iPod. And
the Apple toilet.
But exactly, but immediately people began, you know, there was a heck of a lot of, yeah, it's just it's design, it's style over substance, people would say. I used to do a lot of tech blogging at the time, and I would come across this view, people, and this is a deep misunderstanding of the philosophy of aesthetics. You know, le style c'est l'homme, as, you know, the style is the man, as the French used to say. Style is substance, and here's an example of this is an iPad, but if you scale it down with the first iPhone, when it came out, I remember lots of people saying to me, well, I've got this Microsoft Windows phone, Windows mobile phone. It can do this, and this, and this. Can yours do this, and this? And I said, this is the wrong language. This is why you've made a mistake. Do you say of your dog, my dog can do 7 tricks, one more than you, that's why I love it? What Jony's extraordinary design, the pinch and the zoom and the stroke, it accessed deep parts of ourselves that are emotional, that when we look down into a baby's eyes, we feel, we fondle, we stroke, we glide. I know it sounds all very silly, but that is what we do every day with
Give
this
it a little
object.
stroke.
Yeah, exactly, with this object in our pocket. It involves the really human part of us, not a series of menus that drill down into, you know, it's intuitive and it's...
thank you very much.
That matters. Yeah, yeah.
There was a lovely thing that Stephen probably won't remember that he said, and it's one of many things he said which I wish I'd said. And when the iPad came out, there was a general scepticism about the value of the product. And do you remember we'd made an iPod that had the same sort of touch?
No.
And I remember being in a meeting with Stephen and somebody had said, this is okay, I suppose, but really, let's be honest, it's just a big iPod Touch. And he said, irritatingly quickly, well, that's like saying a swimming pool is just a large bath.
By the way, the first time Jony was in Dorky was to deliver the iPod to The Edge and myself. It was the U2 iPod, something that many of you may have forgot, but it was a great thing for us. We had our own iPod, and we'd never met Jony, and he arrived and stayed here, and it was his first glance of the village and this community. But the iPod, of course, transformed music, and they had this crazy idea. This went for years, actually, where people paid for music, and actually Apple were protecting the rights of artists. They opened the iTunes store. Yeah. And so when you went into publishing, I thought the same thing that would happen was just going to be that for books. But it turns out the iPad is a completely different experience and portal. And I draw on it. I, you know, make art on it. We love it. Stephen, can I ask you about, you know, you were talking about heroes and mythos, these two great books that you have out. And are there stories, are there myths that that you feel we could live without? What are the myths that you think these are essential for these present times?
Well, there are two that I think are remarkable and show that the Greek myths, I mean, Carl Jung used the phrase the collective unconscious for the authorship of myth. The myths are authored by the collective unconscious of a people. And the Greeks, and these are two very famous myths. One is the myth of Pandora. In order to punish mankind for having been given fire by Prometheus, Zeus sent down this extraordinary female, the first female to the humans. The humans were all male at this time. And each god gave her some of their attributes. So she was all gifted, which in Greek is Pandora. And he also had Hephaestus, the smith god, to make, in fact, a jar. It got mistranslated by Erasmus, of all people, into a box, but that's an accident of history, so people call it Pandora's box. So you can call it a box or a jar, it doesn't really matter. And he said, you're not to open it, and its lid. You take it down, live in the world of men. And she married Prometheus' brother, Epimetheus. And, of course, she couldn't resist opening it. And like a lot of creation myths, the poorer women are the ones who are the curious ones who break the, you know, who break the code, the law, like Eve with the fruit. And so Pandora opens up the lid of the jar, and out fly lies, murder, deceit, war, manslaughter, plague, poverty, misery, all the ills of the world into this golden age. Suddenly, everything that we have that makes life, why? So she slams, terrified, as these wheeling, chattering, leathery creatures flying around, and they go off to settle wherever humans have habitation. She slams the lid down, and one little creature is left in the jar to beat its wings helplessly, that she didn't know was in there, which was Elpis, which is the Greek for hope. Hope is left inside. Now, it's a strange way of interpreting it, and lots of philosophers have looked at it, and Nietzsche in particular was obsessed with the idea of hope and saying this was the Greeks at their wisest, because that was the saving moment when hope was left inside, because thank God we don't have hope, because it's the hope that kills. Life is desperate and life is awful. To have hope, there's typical Nietzsche. But anyway, to go back...
Is that a useful one or a useless one?
No, the reason is but I'm just laying it out to tell the story of why it's important. In the late 80s and the early 90s, I jumped onto the internet train. I was incredibly excited by it. I was thrilled when Tim Berners-Lee's World Wide Web arrived and made it even more extraordinary. So there could be graphic interchange of images and hyperlinks to all kinds of places. And throughout the 90s, I, like so many people who started to use it and enthuse about it, thought, it is the all-gifted. This is Pandora. This is everything. It has all, it's a museum, it's art galleries, it's cinemas, it's encyclopedias, it's schools, it's community gathering places, it's small hobby clubs, everybody will get all racial boundaries and all division and tribal loyalties will be dissolved. And at some point, the lid came off, didn't it? At some point, out flew these creatures, these trolls, the malware, the abuse, the misinformation, all the things that now... And it's as if the Greeks understood that every kind of amazing moment of this is the future, it will have a dark side. Everything casts a shadow. And the brighter it is, the more stark and terrible the shadow. And there's no escape from that. But perhaps even more remarkable as a myth, if I can just quickly, was the myth of Prometheus himself, who was the Titan who created us. He created mankind, humankind. And Zeus was delighted by these little creatures who were like gods, and he said they can worship us and they can adore us and how splendid they are. And Prometheus said, I'll teach them everything. I'll teach them this, I'll teach them that, and how to fire clay. And Zeus said, whoa, no. The one thing you cannot give mankind, Zeus, the king of the gods, said, is fire. And Prometheus said, why not? He said, well, if you give them fire, they will be equal to us. And by fire, the Greeks seem to mean the fire that melts and smelts and roasts and toasts, but also the fire, the inner fire, the divine fire, the fire of self-consciousness and difference that makes us separate from animals and makes us creative, the creative spark. And Zeus said, we are the gods. If man had fire, they wouldn't need us anymore. And Prometheus stole fire from the heaven and gave it to us, and Zeus punished him and so on. We're about to face exactly the same thing. And indeed, this could be happening again, because we are the gods and we are making creatures. And by 20 or 30, 40 years' time, we will have made sentient creatures that are a mixture of robotics and bio-augmentation and brain-machine interfacing, and of course AI and genomics and gene editing, which will be manufactured creatures, just as Prometheus made us. And there will be Zeuses and there will be Prometheuses. Some will say, that's fine, you've made them, they can be our servants, they can be playthings, they can adore us, but you must not give them self-consciousness. You must not give them fire, because if you do, they won't need us anymore. We will be a pest, and their AI and their system will just get rid of us. And that is the wisdom of mythology. It understands exactly that. And for all we know, of course, and some philosophers say, this is exactly what happened with Prometheus and the gods. The gods were just another brand of human that made more humans who didn't need them anymore and got rid of them. And the robots will get rid of us, and then the robots will create another life form. And in the early 19th century, the Promethean myth, because we threw off the shackles of religion through the Age of Reason and the Enlightenment, suddenly a lot of artists became obsessed with Prometheus as the human champion. Instead of gods, we had this... and so in the same month, Beethoven wrote a Prometheus overture, and Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein, which was subtitled The Modern Prometheus, about the creation of a new life form. And this is and the Greek myths do this. They speak to something very deep about what we are as creative animals. So those are the two I would choose.
Wow. Yeah. That's incredible.
I could say something...
What's your favourite colour? Red, of course. Very good.
I was going to talk about the new USB to lightning cable, but my heart was sinking halfway through that, thinking there's just not going to be a lot of interest in that now, is it? It's blue.
Is it true that at Apple that you have hired anthropologists and classicists and, you know, people said Steve was obsessed by semiotics and, you know, are there any sort of universals that you are studying to apply your form and function to?
Well, there's part of the way... I don't know if you're familiar with the discipline of ergonomics, which, in its crudest sense, is how we physically fit products. So it's how the AirPods either physically fit or don't your ears. And the way that things physically fit is, I mean, it's complex and involved. And when the volume's extremely high and you're trying to make products relevant to a huge range of different people, it's challenging. But far more challenging is how you make products, I think, that have, I don't know, a cultural resonance that you would, well, I would flail, Stephen could describe, but that you really struggle to articulate why does this somehow seem to mean something to me. And it's funny, we were chatting yesterday about this. When I went to art school, I couldn't afford to go, I couldn't afford to buy a Mac. And so I would sneak into a bureau at night and use it when the cleaners were there. And the most shocking memory I have was not of how much I got done and how much I liked that as a tool, because up until that point, I thought that I was technically inept. I mean, it's funny, isn't it? If you use technology and the experience is poor, you blame yourself. If you eat something and it tastes terrible, you don't blame yourself, do you? And so I had convinced myself that the problems were with me. But I got to use something that was wonderful and effective, but much more powerful was, for the very first time, I got a sense of the people that made this. I got a sense of the things that they cared about. I got a sense of, you know, what preoccupied them, their values, their priorities, to such an extent that I saw this almost just as, you know, vicariously, it was just describing them. And that's how my relationship with Apple started. I wanted to find out more about the people that made this.
You also used the word tool there. you think you see yourself as a tool maker, do you not?
I mean, essentially, absolutely. I mean, I
just think that would be fascinating for people. That's because some of us just think of these as beautiful objects and smart and functional, but for you, they're tools. And I've seen you apply that to other things that we do. And so just tell us about that, your relationship with, you know, just being useful.
Well, I mean, tools... I think it's one of the crudest, but it's certainly a very tangible delineation between fine art and design, or you could call design applied art. But I think it's very clear that what we do is in deference of people doing something far more noble than just looking and rubbing our products, that they really are designed to be powerful tools that enable you to do things you couldn't do without them. Now, tools over hundreds and hundreds of years define civilizations. Of course, civilizations determine tools, but it actually works both ways, and they can be just purely functional, or they can assume a beauty and a gravity and a significance that really is quite extraordinary. But that's very often really only a pointer to what you're actually going to do with it. So I think it's very important for us to remember our place in this, which is, and this is a very genuine sense of this deference of making something to enable people. But when you see what people can do, that can be extraordinary and encouraging.
I heard you yesterday talk about the relationship between a steam iron and a trumpet. Do you mind? I'm not sure I followed it, but I thought I'll find out the end tomorrow. But it was a real clue to the way you see design, I thought.
Well, what happened when... I mean, we can argue when design started, but certainly a significant thing in terms of mass-produced objects. So, you know, maybe that was the Industrial Revolution. And that trundled on for a while, but a very, very significant thing happened with the invention of the integrated circuit. Because it meant that we went from products that are like this, where you understand, almost regardless, we could be most places in the world, and you would understand what that was. That's an advantage over language. You understand its cuppiness because the form is its function. And it's the same with the table and the chair. What happened with the invention of essentially electronics and the integrated circuit was the function became less mechanical and less obvious. And so the meaning of objects became more, really were buried, and things with extremely different functions and roles could actually look essentially the same. So as part of that wrestle in the 80s, there was a movement that was crudely called sort of semantic design. And the idea was that you would desperately try and imbue meaning to an object by referencing something else. So a good example is if we say, you know, is Trevor here? And somebody says, well, there's a silver beetle parked outside. Vicariously, you assume that Trevor's got a silver beetle and that's why he's here. So the idea from a design point of view is you try to help people understand what something is by referencing something else. And so I was talking about, I mean, it was a very bad college project, but it was, I was designing a steam iron. And there are a lot of buttons on steam irons that are sort of solving or dealing with some of the problems in terms of moving gas and changing the direction of air that are sort of similar to what a trumpet has to deal with, and valves on a trumpet. And I designed this steam iron. I designed this steam iron with more buttons than strictly necessary, I have to confess. There were no batteries involved in the making of the steam iron. And it was a very descriptive, rich product in terms of meaning, in terms of helping you understand what to do and what to press. Obviously, it had no... referencing a wind instrument wasn't very helpful. And if you didn't know what a trumpet was, your ironing wouldn't get done. But what's happened as form no longer describes what something does, and almost exclusively everything in here, that's the case. What we're wearing, what we've got on our feet, what we're sat on, the carpet, almost everything in here that doesn't have electronics in, the form describes what it is, and we understand its meaning because of that. And that crosses cultural boundaries and crosses boundaries defined by language difference.
Okay, I've got a complicated one for you. Do you use emojis? And do you feel they're an enhancement for communication, Stephen?
There's a terrible part of me. I know how old I am, and yet I think of myself as young and a pioneer in the world of computing. So the moment mums and dads started answering texts with yay, I started dying of embarrassment.
That's very hurtful.
And when mums and dads use emoticons and emojis, I go, oh, no, don't, no. It's embarrassing, don't. You're a grown-up. And, of course, because I think of myself as a creative person, I'm therefore never a grown-up. I've never been a grown-up. I don't want to be a grown-up. And
you're pulling it off.
So, yeah, thank you. I know. So the fact is I don't use them very much. I do quite like bitmojis, though. I think they're very pleasant. Where you make, or indeed the animojis that Apple come up with over the last few years, where you make a representation of yourself, which you can then insert into a text of some kind. And those are quite fun.
Okay. Yeah. Well, talking about the power of words and words, naming of objects was one of the earliest uses of language, and the naming of cities. You know, whether even if you think about the renaming of Burma to Myanmar, whatever.
Yes, yes.
This man here in the front row gave me my name, Bono. Gogi did there, and there's a power in giving out names, and. I was just thinking, you had a bird louse named after you called Sipocellum Stephen Fry-Eye. And it was named after you in honour of your contributions as the host of QI. How do you feel about being a bird louse?
I feel lousy, obviously.
All right.
But I do think it crosses across to what Jony was saying about naming and about words and so on. You talk about tools. These are tools. Tools have no, I think the smart phrase for it that a philosopher would use is no moral valency. They are neutral morally. An axe can cut down a tree and warm a family and make objects, or it can attack someone and behead them in a savage manner. And the same is true of an iPhone or a computer. They can create a thing of beauty, they can connect people, or they can destroy, bully, coerce, and do monstrous things and deceive. And this was particularly true, one of the great moments, if Steve Jobs and your work and Tim Berners-Lee's work in creating the World Wide Web was one kind of revolution, part of the information revolution, the digital revolution. There was an earlier one that you can look back on and learn a lot from, which was to do with words. And that was Gutenberg's 1450 revolution, where he used movable type to create books. And that exploded in just the way the World Wide Web did. In 1450, there were no printed books in the world, a few Korean ones using block and porcelain type, but not movable type of the kind we know, the lead type, that could produce the same book again, make hundreds of copies, thousands of copies. And print shops opened all over Europe, and particularly Northern Europe, in northern France and Strasbourg and in Amsterdam. And from there being 0 printed books in 1450, by 1515, say, just to make it 75, 65 years afterwards, which happens to be the year that Martin Luther nailed his proclamations on, there were millions from nowhere. And again, it seemed like this was the window to everything great, but printing too has no moral valency. You can print the works of John Keats, or you can print Mein Kampf. The print and the language don't know. It's all in our hands. And what's special about language, so many things are special about it, of course. It is the structure that describes all other structures. You've probably heard of structuralism as this sort of Parisian movement, and post-structuralism and so on. And what they did is they took the work of linguists like Saussure, the earliest proper linguists, who had sort of expanded our own understanding of language, because language, unlike other art forms or other means of communication, can examine itself with language. You use language to describe language. And so, you know, the morphology, the way language, the syntax, the semantics, the meanings, the signs of language were all codified. And then people said, this is a structure, it's a human structure. We have created this language, I mean, not willingly or consciously, and it is that structure that defines all other structures. So you can talk about the semantics of a cup. You can talk about the phonetics or the phonemes of a bottle. You know, you use language as the primary thing, but it's also, it doesn't need anything else. A musician needs to know what a chord is.
Steady.
Well, hey, 4 chords. I don't know. I was going to go 4. Status quo will always be 3, but you two can have 4.
Thanks very much.
But you know, there is this reserved language, a sub-language for music and for painting. You want to paint, you have to know what hot air brushes and linseed oil and acrylics and the difference between them. And there's a whole sort of codified world, and you have to enter it. And the same with music. What's an A7th or a diminished this or an augmented that? And what are these harmonies? It's a special language. But we are born with this ability to speak, and unless there's something terrible happens to us or we have a dysfunction, everybody can. And you are using language now. All of you are using language by listening. Your brains are processing language, which takes as much energy, as many calories in your brains as it does for me to transmit it. And we all have this as a gift. It's an extraordinary thing that we have. And the idea that it is being used for such dark purposes is a stain upon us all, because we all own language. It is what distinguishes us from other species.
Right.
And it can do such good, but it can also do extraordinary great things.
On that subject, you talk about the invention of the Wittenberg press, the production of the Bible, the Reformation that followed it, and then the 30 Years' War, which destroyed Europe, and
Counter-Reformation,
you know,
and so on,
the technology arrives, and then you have to develop a new politics to cope with it.
And that's exactly the point. That's what's happening here.
And so, Jony, you are part of, you know, a 30 square mile radius around Stanford and Palo Alto, and these extraordinary companies that have grown up within 30 miles of each other, Sun Microsystems, and I mean, the ideas anyway, you know, Apple and Facebook and Google. And we're in a moment now where, particularly social media, but it's not just that, but the World Wide Web and the phenomenon that allows it is changing the politics. And the lid is coming off Pandora's jar. I'll always remember that. And how do you feel about that? Do you feel, and how do the people around you feel? Because this is not an object per se. This is not a hard object. It's a soft object. It's a software that's coming. People access it through the hardware. But is there a sense in your community of responsibility for this changing of politics and some of the dark currents of it? For fuck's sake. I mean, putting songs in people's phones without them asking. That type of thing. Dark stuff.
There's, well, first of all, there's one very big danger is that we say Silicon Valley, and Silicon Valley is made up of, could not be the, I mean, extremely diverse companies with diametrically opposed values and motivations. I think there's, of course, there is a danger, by definition, if you are going to do something new, one would trust that you're doing it with, you know, that it's well motivated. But if you're going to do something new, there will be consequences that are planned, intended, and hoped for. And then there's going to be a whole range of consequences that you didn't expect. And that's then the beginning. And then you've got a whole bunch of approaches that you can take. But and so I'm only going to speak to Apple, and I'd like to say things about lots of other people, but I'm just going to talk about Apple, in that we feel responsible. Now, that doesn't mean that we had an intention to create some of these consequences. They were a surprise, but you can't then just walk away. And so we are trying our very best to understand how we can be most useful in trying to address some of those unforeseen consequences. So whether it's things like screen addiction, where we are using these devices too often. Now, our business model, some business models require the, you know, the extensive and frequent use of your screen. And so that business model, I would argue, is fundamentally irresponsible.
The attention economy.
Yeah. We don't. We sell you a phone. And we sell services, but we are very careful in making sure that the way that our business model is configured, that it won't inherently cause us to behave in ways that we don't think is correct. So it's interesting because you're dealing with surprises and but regardless of whether you had intended them or not, I think it's really important that you feel responsible. And we are working really hard to try and deal with some of those things that I think we all agree aren't good.
Yeah, the unintended consequences. I mean, radio, of course, changed the world also.
Yeah.
And radio was the medium that begat the genocide in Rwanda. It was the misuse of radio that got that frenzy going. Stephen...
It also, of course, saved lives every single day on aeroplanes. You couldn't have flight without radio.
Right.
We couldn't have civil flight unless radio had come
Of
first.
course.
It's a very important point. And just a quick story, because I love things like this, in case you didn't know. But, no, it just speaks to... You talked about Silicon Valley, and it just reminded me. Do you know why Silicon Valley is where it is? I mean, no.
Jony lived there.
Why the Silicon, the industry moved there? It's one man, extraordinary man.
I thought it was Stanford.
Nobel Prize winner. No, it wasn't even Stanford. Stanford was a railway baron. He was one of the people who connected the
there's
continent.
the college.
No, Stanford the man was connected New York to San Francisco, as it were, along with he was one of the four railway barons, and he left his fortune to found a university. But there was a man called William Shockley who worked on the East Coast. And in the 1950s, late 40s and early 50s, he invented a new device, an extraordinary device, called a transistor, which opened up a new science called electronics. And it was astonishing. It replaced the valve tube-type things that heated up. And he happened to be born in a small town of no value to anybody called Palo Alto in Northern California. And he left. And he took some of the people from the Bell Labs, where the Bell Telephone Company, where he'd worked, to him. And they all got tired of him because he was a very weird and peculiar man. He'd won his Nobel Prize, but he was odd. And one of them was Gordon Moore. and they set up a new company. They were in the area, they might as well stay in the same area, in the Santa Clara Valley, and they called it integrated electronics because they were going to integrate all the different pieces of these. And so integrated electronics became Intel, and Intel made these extraordinary devices with lots of transistors on. And Gordon Moore said, in about 1963, he said, do you know what? Every 18 months or so, you can double the amount of transistors you can fit in the same space. It's been known as Moore's law, this exponential law of doubling and doubling and doubling and doubling. And this has come true. And the reason for the astonishing power of computing is simply because you're able to increase that. But the reason is this man happened to be born in Palo Alto. He could have been born in buttfuck Idaho, for all I know. and there you go. Anyway,
just another point on that, because it's a political one. We live in a world where the free market is people are in bow down to it. But it's worth remembering that in the United States, after the Russians had their Sputnik and led on the space race, that the government decided, the American government decided that they better catch up. Yeah. And so they invested in, I think, 4 universities in science and physics. Carnegie Mellon, MIT.
Caltech was one of them?
Caltech and Stanford.
And Stanford, yeah.
So all those things coming together. I was about to ask you, and we've never even discussed it, but I'd really like to hear your thoughts on propaganda, because we are all of us activists in certain ways. We use propaganda. You know, I use it for One or for Red. You for Comic Relief or Goalkeepers. Now, you know, you use language to propel an idea. It's a kind of propaganda. How do you feel about propaganda? And this is the follow-on, if you could get there in this, how do you think the storytelling's been going? Say, for instance, if you apply it to the Remain campaign in the UK or the Leave campaign, how are the storytellers there? So propaganda into our ability in the liberal community to explain ourselves and make our story, our narrative compelling.
It's a terrific question and a huge one, and I'm sure we've both got thoughts about it. Propaganda is, many of you will know, of course, is a word from the Roman Catholic Church, who wish to propagate the word. Propaganda is the gerund, that which must be propagated.
Awesome.
And
the hands went up.
There was a wonderful Vatican job called the Cardinal Prefect of Propaganda, whose job was in charge of that. And, of course, but we associated, of course, with Joseph Goebbels, and we associate it with what now we would call fake news or something similar. We associate it with a loaded, freighted, twisted kind of message that is being sent out. Rhetoric is the benevolent side of it. Rhetoric is the art of persuasion. And we're used to that in advertising, and we're used to it in public relations and so on, and we're used to it in oratory, and in anyone who wants to persuade something or something, they use rhetoric. They shift and point language in such a way as to seduce and beguile the listener into thinking their point of view or their suggestion for action or whatever it might be is a cogent and a useful one. And that was fine. But now we're more familiar with the idea that what was originally called mass media, radio and television, can be used to send messages, as in Rwanda, telling one people that the other people were cockroaches and that they must be eliminated, and firing up, touching some part of what it is in us to be human. And the point is, we must not say them. I'm convinced of this, that there was a World War II poster in the tubes, and it said, it's not you that's letting the country down, it's the man standing next to you. And it's not their fault, it's my fault. It's my fault for being human. Until we can all say that, and we will propagate bad things, because about Brexit and so on, I have my views. I think I'm right. But we know from the the science of the brilliant people like Daniel Kahneman and so on, and this has become common currency now, this awareness of confirmation bias and salience bias and the absolute unreliability of our cognition, really, when it comes down to it. We have to be brutally honest with ourselves. It's not just about listening to the other side, it's about having the power to be submissive in the face of outrage and in the face of lies, and finding a way to allow people to listen to themselves and to listen to truth, and not to continue to whip up the anger and the hatred. At the moment, we've all discovered, because of technology, you know, if you accidentally have tin foil in your mouth and it touches a filling, and you get straight to the nerve. Or you say a G-spot is a similar idea, something that gets straight to the nerve. We know how to touch people now and touch them off. And we're all talking about the indignation industry and the outrage industry, and how outraged people are and how insulted and offended they are. But it's always they. It's never we or me. The reason the country's going to the dogs, the reason the culture is going to the dogs is me. And until I have the humility to say, no, it's no good me just attacking and attacking. Of course, there are standards you live by that you hope are honourable and kindly and decent, and that you will, you'll not compromise on that. But listening to others, it's no good talking about people in the abstract, ever. You've got to say, the great Irishman, Jonathan Swift, he said, although I love Andrew and Peter and John and Michael, I loathe and abominate and detest the race called man. And I think that's the way we've got to think. Don't think of them as a mass. Think of the individual and who are they? Can I speak to them? And can I write to them? If we can just be the one to bow down first, we are not only the one likely to end these wars of outrage, but we're also, if we want to be boastful about it, we're clearly the strongest, because only the strongest can do that.
Can I push you a little further? Can I just push you a little further on this? In America, had some great storytellers.
Yes.
That served its mythology. Hollywood, this incredible new technology and medium, served the idea of the American dream, which really meant, everyone is equal and all the rest of it. And Irish people loved that story. It was a very strong narrative. Europe doesn't seem to have the same storytelling agilities. Give us your thoughts on that, because I think it's the most romantic idea, Europe. Everyone's speaking a different tongue, but with the one voice. It just seems to be the most romantic idea, but I don't think we've done a very good idea. I don't think we've done a very good job at getting that story out. And you're a great storyteller, so just while you're on that subject.
Here's a story version of it, which has no real basis in science or evolution or biology, but I did a documentary about mental illness and my own sort of struggles with bipolar disorder, and I went to America, where I had a lot of friends who were bipolar, and Carrie Fisher, one of them, who sadly died a couple of years ago, and she said, it's not only okay to be gay and Jewish and manic depressive or bipolar in Hollywood, it's more or less essential. As all three, I thought, well, that's pretty good. And then I talked to other people, and this idea came to me. It's a metaphor. I don't think it's necessarily true, but it kind of, it's like a myth. It's like a creative myth. Suppose in Europe there were all kinds of people, but you divide it into two, brothers and sisters, one of whom was bipolar. And the two sides of bipolar are the depression, you're pissed off with where you are and you hate it, but there's also the mania, this feeling there's something over the hill, there's something you can do, there's something just out of reach, something you can make, you can believe in yourself, you can do it. When you're manic, you're up till, you don't sleep, you're phoning people, you're making plans, you're designing things, you're writing things, you're absolutely insane. You feel like Joan of Arc, you're radiating. And they said, there's got to be something better than this. Have you heard of America? It's going to be. I'm going to go there, and the ordinary non-bipolar one said, "Oh no, I'm staying here." This is, "Oh no, I don't know what's more. I don't think I'd like it. I don't think it's nice. No, I know I'm only a peasant here, and I've got to, obey the lord of the manor, or I've got to obey the squire, or whatever it is. But no, you go." So America was filled up with people who have this spirit, and their entrepreneurialism, their risk-taking, which is, one of any psychiatrist here will know that risk-taking is one of the things of mania. You take risks. You're exhibitionist. You show off. And you just dare to do things. And America is a very bipolar place. But Europe is, oh well, could be worse. And they have a phrase in America which is only in America. And that's, you hear the news anchors say it. So somebody has, walked up the side of a building as Spider-Man and done something weird and then flown off. And they go, only in America. And if you said only in Britain, it would be something involving rain, misery, queuing, some bad piece of bureaucracy only in Britain, And that is a big difference. But America does mythologize itself. And I'll just quickly pinch that loaf with a thought from my friend who also died. All my friends died. You could probably have boredom. But this was Gore Vidal, the great, we were at dinner, and Gore Vidal, the great novelist and wit, and someone was saying about coming over from Mayflower, my ancestors, I can trace my ancestors back from the Mayflower land at Plymouth Rock, to escape persecution, religious persecution. And Gore Vidal said, no. You misunderstood the matter entirely. That is an American myth. The dissenters and the Plymouth Brethren and the Quakers and the Baptists and the others, they left Britain and arrived in America so they could be free to persecute. And that is a literal historical fact. In the time, in what we call the Glorious Revolution, I'm not talking about James II and the Battle of the Boyne, for heaven's sake. But around that time, it became illegal to persecute Quakers and these new dissenting religions, the Shakers and the Levelers, and so on. Because we had the Restoration and then the Glorious Revolution with William IV and Mary, and the Bill of Rights was in 1688, and they all went to America so that they could set up a pure levelers community. And you read Nathaniel Hawthorne and the early American writers, they're beating and burning and exiling people from other religions in a way that wouldn't be allowed in Britain. Now, I'm not saying Britain's a perfect country or England was a perfect country then at all. There was terrible persecution of all kinds of other people and so on. But it is a mistake for America not to understand its own history in that way. That's all I would say.
Okay. So we're not going to get you on Europe then, okay? Sorry. Okay, that's helpful. We just love to hear you speak, and we just want to hear you cohere on these subjects that mean so much to us here in Ireland, especially. We really care about Europe, and when you two were going through Britain. And we had this idea which we were going to drop the European flag, and there was a great band meeting, so it was going to be a big moment. We're going to drop the European flag, and people were like, that's going to be great. And I said, no, we're going to make it great. And so with storytelling, we set up that moment, and then we managed to really get across emotion and our feelings about Europe. And then people said, well, try that in Manchester. So we did in Manchester, and it was an amazing feeling. And yes, there was people there, of course, who'd be more on the side of Remain than Leave. But what I found myself saying to the audience was, look, Britain, you're great. You were great before you joined Europe. You'll be great after. But we will be less great for your leaving. And Ireland, your neighbours, you know, we really care about you, and we are saying to you that we are less. And there was a feeling in the audience, and it felt to me like we just got to it too late. And I mean, in terms of the storytelling about Europe, and I just have to say
the dread word sovereignty that is being used by Brexiteers at the moment. We want our control back. We want sovereignty. What do they think it is to be a sovereign nation? Maybe to be a sovereign nation, you could make a decision to legalise cannabis, as Portugal and the Netherlands have done, who are both EU countries. Or you could have same-sex marriages legalised, as we did in Britain. Or you could have a plebiscite, a referendum in Ireland to decide about things like abortion and same-sex relations, as you did. You all European countries are completely sovereign to change their laws. Have you ever been to the countries of Europe? They are absolutely themselves. The French couldn't be more French. This lie of what sovereignty is. We're a monarchy in Britain. You're a republic. All these things are utterly... The only laws that are slightly changed are trade laws, which are imposed, but we elect people to it. So we're going to leave an elected European Union where we send MEPs and the Council of Ministers, where everyone acts all for one and one for all, and for the benefit of the European mass. And we're going to go and try and make a trade deal with a man whose motto is America first.
Right.
I mean, how insane can that possibly be?
Yes.
It's just incredible.
You had to deal with the one whose name shall not be mentioned in my mouth. And your CEO, Tim Cook, did very well as an openly gay man to go in and sit with a president and with those views that he is famous for, and be himself and arguing on Apple's case. I mean, you're in politics now, aren't you? I mean, Apple is that big that, it's the largest company in the world. And you set out, it's so amazing. We've known each other since the 80s, and not personally, but we met through music, and it's just an astonishing journey for me to see you as an artist, somebody that I feel and Edge feels such a kin with. And now you've helped build this company. You've invented objects that have built a company that is the largest company in the world and is, in the top few discussions in the trade talks between President Xi Jinping and President Trump. I mean, how does that make you feel? Vulnerable, maybe?
Not as vulnerable as talking after Stephen. But no, I would like to steer the conversation back to my USB cable. I think there are... I think we've always been interested in if our motivation is right and our goals are right and we believe obviously righteous, that good things happen. And I think actually going back to what Steve said before, if you are utterly consumed, genuinely and utterly consumed by wanting to make something to express your gratitude and thanks, and you do it well, I think the consequences may not be immediate, but I think they can be surprising and profound and of significance.
Well, I want to say, I've one last question for you both. Before I ask it, I want to just mention this object that I feel very strongly about, which is this red iPhone, because this object has so much resonance with me. I see it every day, and it makes me really grateful, and because not only is it a beautiful phone, this pays for AIDS drugs for people who can't afford them, and Apple has I mean, it's about $200 million given to the Global Fund through RED. And on top of that, Jony and his best mate, Mark Newson, have done an auction on behalf of RED. And I pushed him on why RED, and he described those antiretroviral therapies, those pills, as beautifully designed. And I just, if you could explain on that so the object, for it to be a great design, it doesn't have to be an object. It can be a therapy. And
yeah, I mean, it has to work, and it's something that doesn't work. And I'm sure I'm going to get a lot of email, even though actually you don't have my email address. But if something doesn't work, it's ugly.
Yes.
It's profoundly ugly. And the beauty of these pills were that they worked. I mean, they worked well enough to save people's lives. And I don't know of a more astonishing and noble beauty than that. But the design is a curious mixture of function, and things need to work. And we could talk for hours about our definitions of function, but of this way that we do communicate with each other very subtly. Like, you know, did somebody care about me, or were they careless? But also, design can bring beauty to solving mundane problems, everyday problems, as well as extraordinary euphoria with pills that can save people's lives.
well, thank you. And thank you. So the last question. It's somewhat heretical idea, but I want to ask you both. I want to ask you about silence. You, who is so gifted in filling the silence with language. And I want to ask you about space, as an empty space, not outer space. Although that's for later. But please, can you give us your, your work has made our lives somewhat dense with possibilities. So how do you feel about space?
Well, there's a danger that you can interpret what we do at a very superficial level visually as being minimal. And that's a stylistic decision, not a philosophy or approach in our case. One of the dangers is that if you solve a difficult problem, you're a little bit fizzy and a little bit proud, and you'd like to wag your tail in someone's face to say, I just solved this. And you can express the solution. And as a designer who's been working by themselves, and it's been hard, and they're very proud of this solution, it's awfully tempting to try and express yourself. But it's far more important to remember that to not make the solving of difficult problems, that's just your job. And our job is to try and create products that are as simple as possible. And that definition is, it's not simple as a style, it's just so that there's not a load more stuff that you have to deal with. We've got so many things that we're bombarded with, obviously, throughout the day. And our goal has been to try and create space in our products, literally and sort of metaphorically, but for there to be space. And in the case of a tool, that's ever so important, because this is the means to a much bigger end and a much more important end, I think.
Stephen, silence?
Silence, it's a really interesting one. Those who follow me on Twitter might know that my little Twitter bio, it says, how can I tell you what I think until I've heard what I'm going to say? and it is something I do believe, and it sounds kind of tricksy, but it's a very deep problem with language and thought, and many philosophers have pondered over it, notably Wittgenstein, of course, which was, can you think outside language? Is it possible to think without using words inside your head? And I do sometimes do an exercise in which I try and think without using words inside my head. It's a very hard thing to do. You know, it's like saying to someone, don't think of an elephant. Immediately an elephant is pictured in their head. And I found that there's nothing I can think about which doesn't involve language except one thing. And this sounds as if I'm just being silly, but it's actually just true. I'm just telling you the truth. I can think about history or relationships or whatever it is, and words come into my mind, names, things. I can't take them out. But sex, I can just think of, because I'm feeling it, or it's a different thing. I mean, I'm not saying... don't get me wrong, but it's just a peculiar coincidence. That's the one thing where I find maybe that is outside language. And maybe that's because it's the oldest impulse any life form has ever had since the first eukaryotic life forms were formed in the primordial soup. So it's the first thing we have in our brains. But everything else, language, to me, is essentially who I am. And the expression of things in words, I find, defines me completely. But I would just... Can I just end with this? Because it's what you said about ugliness, and I think it's... And I want to quote a great Irishman here, so it's Oscar Wilde. When he, as you probably know, even before he'd written any book that was worth reading, he was famous because of the way he spoke and the way he dressed and the way he behaved. So much so that the set that he moved in, James McNeill Whistler, the painter, and others, were cartoons in Punch. And Gilbert and Sullivan wrote an operetta making fun of their set, which is extraordinary, called Patience. Anyway, Richard Doyley Cart, who ran Gilbert and Sullivan, thought he always took the operas and put them on Broadway in America. But he thought, I can't do Patience on Broadway because they have no idea who these aesthetes are, these people, you know, who say everything is, oh, too utterly utter and, you know, talk in that sort of special way. So he paid Oscar Wilde a gigantic sum of money to spend a year doing a lecture tour all around America and becoming famous from the way he dressed and the way he spoke, which duly happened. And it was a great success. And the press in America were fascinated by him. They'd never seen anything like it. And one of them said, and this to me is just fascinating, and I can understand why an American said it, because we're talking about the 1880s, and they'd just had a civil war, not just a civil war, the bloodiest internecine conflict in human history to this day, man on man, the worst and bloodiest war. And this was a nation founded in the most glorious, harmonious principles of the Enlightenment. It was founded on beauty and trust and nobility and interoperation and a pure democracy, and it had descended into this awful war. And not only that, but even after the war, in Chicago, where he, at this particular time, there was gang warfare, there was corruption and extortion. The native people were being wiped out systematically, were being distributed with smallpox blankets to get rid of them by an act of genocide. They were slaughtering species. There were gangs of New York, of course. And a lot of Americans, thinking Americans, would say, well, what went wrong? We're only just 100 years old. And we were so idealistic. It was going to be the greatest, purest, most wonderful country. And yet it's exploded with blood and violence and hatred. Why? And so they were asking a lot, and Wilde happened to be in Chicago, and a journalist said, Mr. Wilde, can you explain why there is so much violence in the United States? He says, well, of course I can, he said, because your wallpaper is so ugly. You know, again, people laugh, but as always with Oscar, you drill down. What he's really saying is, as human beings, when we look out of the window, we look out at the world, look out there, everything we see in nature is beautiful, unconditionally and extraordinarily beautiful. The sky, the hills, the animals, whether it's the Arctic wastes or the deserts or the fells and the mountains, it doesn't matter. And things that are made by us are ugly. So many of them stamped out cheap ornaments in this new industrial age in which everyone was living, which was charging full ahead in America with trains and steel and everything was happening, and no one was taking care in what they were making. There was no sense of beauty. It was contemptuous. It was cheap, and it was harmful. And that's what an aesthete really means. Beauty is a guide to morality. You don't have to be told anything that Donald Trump had said. You don't. You just have to look at the Taj, the Taj Mahal casino in Atlantic City. You just have to look at the taste of the Trump Tower to know that there is the depth of that vulgarity means something morally. It really does. It's not. The aesthetics are not the icing on the cake, or it would be nice if things were pretty. They are the cake, and that's what Apple understood. The style is the substance, and Oscar always knew that.
Ladies and gentlemen, Stephen Fry, Jony Ive.